My name is Henry Calloway. I am 68 years old, and I am dying. I don't say that to earn your sympathy. I say it because it is the plain truth, and I have spent too many years in this life being indirect about plain truths. The doctor came out from Miles City 3 weeks ago, pressed his cold hands against my chest, listened to whatever sound my lungs were making, and then stepped out into the hallway to speak with my eldest son in a hushed voice that he believed I could not hear. I heard every word. A man lying still in a quiet room hears everything. That is perhaps the one advantage of dying. The world gets very loud when you stop moving through it. The year is 1890. The ranch sits on 1,100 acres of Montana ground, and outside this window the snow has been falling since the first week of November, without much pause. I can see it from this bed. The pale gray light of a Montana winter is a specific kind of light. It doesn't warm you. It just reminds you that warmth is somewhere else. I've looked out at that light for 41 years, since I was 27 years old, and drove the first fence post into this frozen earth with nothing but a borrowed mallet and the stubborn conviction that this land would become something. It became something. That is not vanity. That is record. 1,100 acres, 400 head of cattle, a barn that I rebuilt twice, a main house with 6 rooms, 2 horses of genuine quality, a smokehouse, a root cellar packed to the ceiling, water rights along the creek that 3 neighboring ranchers have tried to acquire over the years and failed. All of it built from the kind of work that doesn't have a name, because naming it would require slowing down long enough to describe it, and there was never time for that. I built it with my wife, Margaret, who died in the winter of 1882 from a fever that the same doctor from Miles City could not explain to my satisfaction. I have not been fully warm since. Not in the chest. The body gets warm, the fire does its work, but there is a particular cold that settles into a man when the person who understood him best is gone, and no amount of wool blankets addresses it. I mention Margaret because she is relevant to everything that follows. She always was. Now I lie in this bed, and my children come and go through this room, and I watch them the way a man watches weather rolling in across a flat plain, with full attention, because what is coming will determine everything. I have 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. Thomas is the eldest. He is 41 years old and has his mother's jaw and my stubbornness, which is a combination that produces a man who is very good at being certain and not particularly gifted at being right. Thomas came back to the ranch 7 years ago after spending his 20s in Helena, trying to become a businessman. He ran a dry goods operation that did well for 3 years, and then did poorly for 2, and then closed entirely. He returned with a wife named Clara, who is a decent woman, a son of his own named James, who is 11 years old, and a manner about him that suggests he believes returning to the ranch was a concession he made to the universe rather than a retreat. Thomas has managed the cattle operation since his return, and he has managed it competently. I want to be fair about that. He is competent. Competence, I have learned, is not the same as character, but it is not nothing either. Eli is the second son. He is 37 years old and has always been the most charming of my children, which is a quality that served him beautifully until the moment it stopped serving him and started serving itself. Eli lives in Billings, where he has a small law practice, and a wife named Ruth, who I have met on 4 occasions and liked on all 4. They have no children, which I know grieves Ruth more than Eli lets on. Eli came home 2 weeks ago, when word reached him through Thomas that the doctor had been summoned. He arrived with a leather bag, a freshly pressed suit that had no business being worn in a Montana winter, and a quality of attention that I recognized immediately, the attention of a man calculating. Eli is not cruel. I want to be clear about that. He is not a cruel man, but he is a man who has learned to move through the world by understanding what other people want and positioning himself adjacent to it. And that habit does not disappear simply because the man doing the calculating is your own son and you are the thing being calculated around. Daniel is the youngest son. He is 34, and of all my children, he is the one who most resembles the man I was before this land got into me and changed me. Daniel is restless the way young Montana is restless, always sensing that something better exists just past the next ridge, always finding reasons that the present situation is temporary. He spent 3 years working cattle drives down through Wyoming and Colorado before coming back north. He spent 2 years on a mining operation near Butte, that made him enough money to prove to himself that money was not the thing he was actually after, which is the kind of lesson that costs exactly as much as it takes to learn and not a cent more. Daniel has been living on the ranch for the past 18 months, ostensibly helping Thomas with the operation, actually spending a considerable amount of time staring out windows and riding out alone in the early morning hours. He is a man who has not yet found the shape of his own life, and he feels that acutely. I know because I was that man once, and I recognize the specific quality of frustration it produces. And then there is Rose. Rose is 29 years old, my youngest child, and she has lived on this ranch her entire life, with the exception of 2 years she spent in Bozeman at a women's academy, after which she came home and has been here since. She has never married, not because she lacked opportunity. She is a handsome woman with her mother's particular quality of stillness, but because the opportunities that presented themselves were, in her estimation, inadequate, and she is not a woman who settles for inadequate. She helps manage the household. She keeps the accounts with a precision that would embarrass most men. She has been the one, these past 3 weeks, who brings me my meals, who changes the cloth on my forehead when the fever climbs, who reads to me in the evenings when the pain in my chest makes sleep difficult. She sits in the chair beside this bed and reads from whatever book she has most recently acquired, and the sound of her voice reading is one of the last genuinely comforting sounds available to me in this world. She has not been included in any discussion about the inheritance. I want you to hold that fact in your mind as I continue, because it is the central fact of everything that follows. The first conversation I witnessed that I was not supposed to witness happened on the 3rd day after Eli arrived. I had been sleeping in the middle of the afternoon, which I do now with a regularity that still surprises me. A man who spent 40 years rising before the sun and working until after it set, now sleeping in the afternoon like a child. I woke to the sound of voices in the hallway just outside my door, and because the voices were low and deliberate in the way that voices are when the speaker believes the listener is asleep, I kept my eyes closed and my breathing slow, and I listened. It was Thomas and Eli. Thomas was explaining something about the water rights along the North Creek, how they were the single most valuable asset attached to the property aside from the main house structure, how the Hendersons over the ridge had been making quiet inquiries for years. Eli responded in that smooth, measured voice he uses when he is thinking faster than he is speaking, asking questions about the deed documentation, about whether the water rights were attached to the land title or held separately, about what the legal instrument would require in terms of transfer. I lay still and listened to my 2 eldest sons discuss the legal mechanics of property that I had not yet finished dying to leave behind. It was not a villainous conversation. I want to be precise about this. They were not scheming against me. They were not wishing me dead any faster than I was already managing on my own. They were doing what men do when they sense that something is ending, and they are positioned to inherit what remains. They were beginning the practical work of figuring out how the pieces would fall. I understood it. I had done similar calculations myself when my own father was failing, though I had the decency, or perhaps just the youth, to feel ashamed of them afterward. What stayed with me was not the conversation itself, but the specific feeling of lying in that bed, hearing my own sons conduct that accounting, and realizing with the full clarity that comes to a man when he is very tired and very still, realizing that neither of them had knocked on my door that afternoon. Neither of them had come in to see how I was. Neither of them had brought me water, or asked after the pain, or sat for a moment in the chair beside the bed simply because I was their father and I was dying in proximity to that mattered. Rose had brought me soup at noon. She had sat with me for 20 minutes while I ate it, not speaking much, just present in the way she is present, occupying a room without demanding anything from it. She had adjusted the pillow behind my shoulders and asked whether the light was bothering my eyes, and then gone back to whatever she was doing. And I had felt, for those 20 minutes, something that I am still trying to name accurately. Not happiness. Something quieter than happiness. Something that happiness is made from. Thomas came to see me that evening. He came in with the manner he has always had, purposeful, shoulders set, the manner of a man who has decided what the conversation will be before it begins. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat in it, and asked how I was feeling, and I told him I had felt better, and he nodded as if I had confirmed something he already knew. Then he began. He talked about the ranch. He talked about what he had built here over the past 7 years. And he was not wrong that he had built things, had improved things, had kept the operation running with real skill during seasons that would have broken a lesser manager. He talked about the plans he had, the expansion of the grazing rotation, a new arrangement with a buyer in Miles City that would improve the price per head. He talked about James, his son, my grandson, how the boy was already showing a natural feeling for cattle work, how there was a real future here for a 4th generation of Calloways if the land stayed intact and in capable hands. He did not say my name during any of this. He said the ranch and the operation and what we've built and the future of this place. But he did not once say, "Father, what do you want?" He did not say, "Father, I want to understand what matters most to you about how this ends." He talked about the ranch the way a man talks about a thing he already owns, and I sat in this bed and watched his face while he talked, and I thought about Margaret, who used to say that the most honest thing about a person is not what they say, but what they assume they don't need to say. Thomas assumed he didn't need to ask. That assumption was the most honest thing about him. When he finished, I told him I was tired. He stood up, put the chair back where it had been, and told me to rest. He paused at the door and said that I should know the ranch was in good hands, and I said that I did know that. He left satisfied. He should not have been. Eli's conversation with me was different in tone, but not, ultimately, in substance. Eli sat in that same chair 2 nights later and talked to me the way he talks to everyone, warmly, attentively, with his full and genuine focus, which is the quality that makes him effective at law and also the quality that makes him difficult to fully trust, because you are never entirely certain whether his attention is given or performed. With Eli, I think the truth is that there's no real difference between the two. He has attended to people so long and so consistently that the performance has become authentic, which is its own kind of genuine and its own kind of something else. He talked about legal matters with a gentleness that was the verbal equivalent of wrapping a blade in cloth. He talked about probate and clear title transfer and the importance of a well-constructed will for avoiding family difficulty down the line. He talked about his own situation in Billings, obliquely. The practice was doing well, but required capital investment to grow into what it could become, and there was an opportunity with a partner that required a certain commitment of funds within the year. He said he was not asking for anything, that he wanted to be absolutely clear about that he was simply providing me with context, because context was useful. Context. That word sat in the room between us for a moment. He has his mother's eyes. That is the difficult thing about Eli. He has Margaret's eyes. And when he looks at me, I feel the complicated grief of a man who sees his dead wife and his living son and cannot fully separate his love for one from his love for the other. And he knows this. Eli knows this. And I am not entirely certain he does not use it. Not consciously. But the way a plant grows toward light is not conscious either. And it grows just the same. I asked him directly what he thought was fair in terms of the inheritance. He was quiet for a moment, which is unusual for Eli. Then he said that he thought what was fair was probably equal division among the children, which was a reasonable position to hold, and also conveniently the position that most benefited a man who had been absent from the ranch for 15 years and contributed nothing to its current value. Equal division would give Eli the same share as Thomas, who had spent 7 years building it, and Daniel, who had spent 18 months helping run it. I asked him about Rose. He paused again, and in that pause I saw something that I cannot call dishonesty exactly, but that I can call a particular kind of forgetting that is close enough to dishonesty to matter. He said that Rose had the house to live in, that she was provided for, that the situation was different with Rose. I asked him how it was different. He said carefully that Rose was unmarried, that her needs were different, that the ranch as an operating concern required a different kind of management than a single woman could reasonably. I stopped him there. I said I was tired. He left with less satisfaction than Thomas had, because Eli is perceptive enough to know when a conversation has not gone the way he wanted, even when he cannot precisely identify the moment it turned. Daniel did not come to speak to me about the inheritance. Daniel came to this room 3 times in the first week, and each time he came in and sat down and looked at me with an expression that I recognized, because I have seen it in the mirror in dark moments. The expression of a person who wants to say something true and does not know how to say it, without it costing them something they are not sure they can afford to spend. He would come in and sit, and we would talk about small things. The weather, a horse he had been working with, a letter he had received from a man he'd ridden with on the cattle drives. The kind of conversation that circles around the real conversation without ever landing on it. On the third visit he finally said it. He said he was sorry. I asked him what for. He said for the way he had been. For the years he had spent going from place to place without purpose. For the times he had come home and been present in body, but somewhere else entirely in his mind. He said he was sorry that it had taken this. A gesture toward the bed, toward me, toward the whole arrangement of my dying, to bring him back into the room in any real sense. I told him that I had not been without fault in that distance. I told him that I had spent too much of his childhood building this ranch, and not enough of it building the relationship between a father and the particular son that Daniel was, the son who needed a different kind of attention than the ranch had ever taught me to give. We sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. That is the specific silence that exists between two people who have finally said the thing that needed saying. Not a silence of emptiness, but of something completed. Then Daniel said that he didn't want the ranch. He said it quietly and directly, the way he says things when he has thought about them long enough to get past what he thinks he should feel and into what he actually feels. He said he had been watching Thomas manage it for 7 years, and Thomas was good at it, and Thomas wanted it in a way that Daniel recognized he did not share. He said he thought maybe there was something for him in the territory further west that he didn't know yet, that he was still finding out, but that it wasn't this. He did not mention Rose, but he looked at the door when he said it briefly, in the way a person's eyes move toward something they are thinking about, but not saying. I noticed. It was Rose who told me, without meaning to, the full shape of what was happening between the brothers. She came in on a Tuesday morning with my breakfast and a book she had just received by post, a collection of essays she had ordered from a publisher in New York. She set the tray down and started talking about the essays the way she talks about books she is excited about, with a quiet, focused enthusiasm that is entirely her own. The way certain people have an enthusiasm that doesn't perform itself for an audience, but simply exists as a fact about them. She told me about the argument one of the essayists was making about land stewardship, about the difference between owning land and being responsible to it. And I listened and ate my breakfast and felt, again, that specific quality of comfort that her presence in a room produces. And then she paused in the middle of a sentence and looked out the window at the snow, and I saw something cross her face. Not distress exactly, but the careful neutrality that a person wears when they are containing something they have decided not to burden someone else with. I asked her what had happened. She said nothing had happened. I told her that in 41 years of this land, and the 29 years of her life that I had been present for, I had never known nothing to look exactly like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Thomas and Eli had been discussing things, that the discussions were sometimes loud enough to be heard from rooms that were not intended to be part of the discussion, that Daniel had come to her the previous evening and told her not to worry, that he would make sure she was taken care of, which was kind of him to say, and which she understood to mean that the question of whether she would be taken care of had been raised and was not fully settled. She said it without bitterness. That is the thing about Rose that undoes me. She says these things without bitterness, not because she doesn't feel the weight of them, but because she has a quality that I can only describe as a kind of long sight, an ability to see past the immediate injustice to something farther out that she is navigating toward. Margaret had that quality. I wonder sometimes if it is a quality that is passed directly from a mother to a daughter through some channel that fathers cannot see. She said she was not worried about herself. She said she had always found a way, and she would find a way. I told her to hand me the small writing desk that sits on the side table. She gave me a look. The doctor had said exertion of any kind was to be limited, and writing was, in his estimation, exertion. I told her I was 68 years old, and had built 1,100 acres from nothing, and was not going to be managed by a flat prohibition on pen and paper. She handed me the writing desk. I need to tell you something about what it is to build a life. Not a ranch, not a property, a life. A life is not the sum of what you accumulate. I know that now in a way that I did not fully know it at 30, or even at 50. At 30 I believed this sincerely, with the full force of a young man who has staked everything on a piece of ground, that the work was the point, that building the thing was the purpose, that when the thing was built, the purpose would be visible in it, the way a finished fence is visible in a field. But the work was never the point. The work was the path I walked while the point was happening around me. While Margaret was learning how to read winter, whether by the way I set my jaw at breakfast, while Thomas was learning stubbornness from watching me refuse to be beaten by a drought that should have finished us in the summer of 1874, while Eli was learning the value of charm by watching me talk a creditor out of a calling note one afternoon in Miles City when I was $29 short of what was owed, while Daniel was learning restlessness from some combination of my early years and his own particular soul, while Rose was learning. What was she learning? She was learning everything. She was the one who watched most carefully and said least about what she saw, and she learned all of it. What I built for Margaret, and when Margaret was gone, I kept building, because stopping would have required me to stand still in the grief, and I was not equipped for that. So I worked, and the boys learned to see the work as the man, and the man as the work, and nobody saw very clearly, except Rose. Rose saw clearly. It is a hard thing to admit that your daughter understood you better than your sons did, not because it reflects poorly on the sons. They were shaped by forces I set in motion, and I take that responsibility. It is hard to admit, because it means that the person who saw you most plainly was also the person you gave the least formal acknowledgement to, the person whose name came up last in conversations about legacy, the person who was described as provided for by a son who has not spent a single night in this house in 15 years. I wrote for 3 days. The will, as it had stood before those 3 days, divided the ranch equally between my 3 sons, with a cash payment to Rose from the operating account, a figure that Eli had, I later learned, suggested as appropriate. A figure arrived at through some calculation I was not consulted on. A figure that represented, essentially, a buyout of a daughter from a birthright she had never been formally given in the first place. I read that old will twice in those 3 days. I read it the way you read a document that you know says what it says, but you keep checking because you want it to say something different. It did not change on second reading. Then I wrote a new one. Rose gets the ranch. All of it. The 1,100 acres, the water rights along the North Creek that the Hendersons have been inquiring about for years, the 400 head, the barn, the main house, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the 2 good horses, and the deed to every inch of ground that I drove a fence post into 41 years ago with a borrowed mallet and a young man's faith that the effort was worth making. Thomas gets the cattle management agreement, a formal right to continue operating the cattle side of the ranch under Rose's ownership, with a fair wage and a share of the annual profit, because he is competent and the ranch needs competence, and there is no reason that acknowledgement of Rose's ownership and acknowledgement of Thomas's skill cannot coexist, if Thomas is the man I believe he has the capacity to be. Eli gets the written account of every legal matter pertaining to the ranch, titles, deeds, water rights documentation, agreements with neighboring ranchers, organized and annotated in my own hand, because Eli is a lawyer and a good one, and this is the inheritance that matches who he actually is. The inheritance of knowledge and clarity, rather than the inheritance of ground he did not work. Daniel gets the smaller north pasture, 40 acres at the edge of the property that abuts open territory, because Daniel told me the truth about himself, and that deserves to be honored, and because 40 acres of good Montana ground at the edge of something wider might be exactly the shape of beginning that a man like Daniel needs. And Rose gets the rest. Rose gets the heart of it. I had Eli's presence noted. He is a lawyer, and I needed a witness who would understand exactly what he was witnessing, which is its own form of clarity that I am not ashamed of. I had Thomas come in as second witness. I had Daniel sign as a third. I told them all, before they signed, what the document contained. I did not soften it. I read it aloud in this bed, in this pale winter light, with all 3 of them standing in this room in various arrangements of shock and stillness. Thomas went red. Not the red of rage. I watched carefully, and it was not rage. It was the red of a man recalculating in real time, running the numbers on what he had assumed and what he was now being told, and finding that the distance between those 2 things was larger than he had prepared for. He stood very still, which is what Thomas does when he is containing something, his jaw set, which is what Thomas does when he is deciding something. I do not know what he decided. I watched his face, and I could not read the conclusion, only the process. Eli's reaction was quieter and more difficult to interpret. He looked at the document for a long moment with the careful, neutral expression of a man who is doing legal analysis and emotional processing simultaneously. He said, very quietly, that he understood. I do not know if he meant it as acceptance or as acknowledgement or as something more complicated than either. Eli is always more complicated than either. Daniel nodded, simply nodded, one slow nod, and then looked at Rose, who was standing in the doorway because I had asked her to come, and she had come without knowing what she was coming to. Daniel looked at Rose, and the expression on his face was something I will carry with me. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at a moral clarity he did not previously know he was capable of reaching. Rose stood in the doorway and did not speak. She looked at the document in my hands, and then at me, and then at the document again. And her face did what her face does when she is holding something large. It went still and careful and honest all at once. She said, finally, in a voice that was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person is putting real effort into steadiness, she said, Papa. That was all. Just my name. The name she has always had for me. I told her to come and sit down. She came and sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair she has been sitting in every evening, the chair that has acquired a particular quality from her sitting in it, the quality of consistent presence, of faithful return, of someone who comes back because coming back is what they are, not because they are owed anything for coming. I signed the will. My hand shook slightly, which the doctor would have attributed to the illness, and which I attributed to the full weight of 41 years being signed over to the person who understood what they were worth. I am going to die very soon. The breathing has a quality now that it did not have 2 weeks ago, a labor to it, a work, as if the lungs are doing something effortful rather than something natural. I know what this means. The doctor told Thomas, and Thomas told me with a directness I respected him for when I asked him to be straight with me. Days, he said, not weeks. I find that I am not afraid. That surprises me less than I would have expected. I think that a man who has done the main work he came to do, who has loved a woman well, who has built a thing from nothing, who has finally, in the last days available to him, done right by the person who most deserved it, I think that man is equipped to look at the end of his days without the particular terror that comes from feeling unfinished. I am not unfinished. I am done in a way that is satisfying. Not perfect. I have made errors that I own completely, errors of inattention and assumption and the particular blindness that comes from spending too much of a life looking at the work instead of the people doing it beside you, but done in a way that has a shape to it, a rightness. Rose is reading to me tonight. She is reading from those essays she received, the ones about land and stewardship and the difference between owning a thing and being responsible to it. I listen to her voice, and the snow is still falling outside the window, and the pale gray light of the Montana winter is doing what it always does, reminding me that warmth is somewhere, just not here. Except that is not quite right tonight. Tonight, in this room, with Rose's voice reading and the lamp putting its particular gold onto the walls of this house that I built. Tonight there is warmth here. There is warmth in this room, in this chair beside me, in this voice, in this. I am going to tell you something that I hope you carry with you. Whoever you are, wherever this voice reaches you, the thing that matters is not what you build. The thing that matters is not the acres or the head of cattle or the water rights or the legal instruments of transfer. The thing that matters is who sits beside you at the end, who comes back to the room, who brings the soup without being asked, who reads to you in the evening not because there is anything in it for them, not because they expect anything, not because they are managing your impression of them, not because they have calculated what they stand to gain, but because they love you in that plain, durable, unfashionable way that does not require an audience. That is the inheritance worth leaving, not the land, the recognition. 41 years I spent on that land. I loved it with the kind of love that you give to the thing you made yourself, to the thing that exists because you willed it into existence through pure sustained effort. I will not apologize for that love. It was real and it made something real. But Margaret loved me better than that land ever could. And Rose loves this family, loves it in that complicated, sighted way that knows exactly what the family is and loves it anyway, better than any of us have earned. And the truest thing I have done in this life, the clearest moment of genuine sense that I can point to, is that somewhere in the last days of it I was given enough clarity to sign a piece of paper that said, I know who you are, and I am not going to let that go unrecognized. The land goes to Rose. My sons left the room. I do not know yet what they will do with what they are feeling. Thomas stood in the hallway for a long time before I heard his footsteps move toward the back of the house. Eli went outside, which in this weather says something about the size of what he needed to be alone with. Daniel went to his room, and I have not heard his door open since. They are all three of them in this house tonight, sitting with what they have been given and what they expected and the distance between those two things, and I will not insult them by pretending to know how that resolves. They are their own men. I made them, and I cannot finish them. That is not a father's job, to finish his sons. It is a father's job to give them enough of what is real that they can finish themselves. I hope they are fair men. I hope Thomas finds, in the arrangement I have made, something he can respect, the continuation of the work he has done, the acknowledgement of his skill, the invitation to keep building something worth building. I hope Eli looks at those annotated legal documents and finds in them not a consolation prize, but an honest accounting of what he contributes to this family, which is real and worthy. I hope Daniel takes his 40 acres at the edge of the wide territory and walks out into it one spring morning, when the snow is gone, and finds there the beginning he has been unable to locate for all these years. And I hope Rose looks at 1,100 acres of Montana ground and sees in it what I see in her, something built with patience and care over a long time, something that endures because it was made with the right materials, something that has in it both the toughness that this land requires and the grace that this life deserves. My name is Henry Calloway. I was 27 years old when I drove the first fence post into this frozen ground with a borrowed mallet and a young man's conviction. I was 68 years old when I signed the last paper of my life, with a steady enough hand, in a room lit by lamplight and occupied by a daughter reading about stewardship and responsibility, and I found that the conviction had not left me. It had simply been waiting all this time to be aimed at the right thing. The snow is still falling. Rose is still reading. I am still here. For now.